We are in the pericope of ways where Jesus raises the widow of Nain's son. Mike tells me, and I don't have any reason to doubt him, that we're on verse 13. When the Lord saw her, he was very sorry for her and said to her, "Stop crying." Now, any way you say that is going to sound more abrupt than it is. I toyed with the idea of saying, "Dry your tears," but for some reason I didn't do it in this version of the translation. I just hoped that I did in the final one. But as I've shared with you many times before, I had to reach a point where I said, that's it. Because you can always improve. I never saw, again, there's no perfect thing. But that is the essence of what Jesus told her. Dry your tears. Now, the reason I know that is that one of the promises that will be in the new heaven and the new earth, in the new creation, that God will take the possibility of tears out of our eyes. Not that there won't be any, you know the old song, "No tears in heaven fair, no tears." So, I almost got that melody. But it means more than that. It means that the occasion for tears will not exist. That's the answer I give to people who say, well, if so-and-so doesn't make it, I just won't be happy. No, I don't know how God will accomplish that, but He will accomplish it so that there will not be any sadness. The song also says, "No sadness of farewell," and that's the idea.
Does it leave room for tears of joy?
That is not dealt with. It may be that tears of joy are included because there will be unending joy. There is the Jewish idea that is reiterated in the New Testament of messianic joy. You remember the three parables in Luke 15 about a lost coin, a lost sheep, and a lost boy? And each one of those, there is more rejoicing in heaven. Now, that means the messianic joy. And the Jews who heard Jesus' parable would immediately identify it that way. Because joy was part of the new creation. And Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:17, if anybody believes in Christ, they are participants or part of the new creation. So the joy that Max is teaching about from Philippians is messianic joy. It says that God is trustworthy. Isn't that exactly the message that he wanted us to get today? That God can be trusted and he is the one in control. I thought immediately about the way I translate the word kingdom in my translation. I put kingdom and a parentheses, rule, R-U-L-E. I could have put reign, but reign is not in our everyday vocabulary. But rule is. We know what rule means. I wish now, see there again, you can always improve, that in light of what Max said today, that I'd put control. But again, you go with where you are. But that's what it means. The kingdom is not a thing or a place. It is God's control. And God is in control. And that's the source of joy. And that's what Jesus meant here when he said, dry your tears. I am in what? Control. See, that is an affirmation of the control of Jesus. That's the reason that in his own person, when he was on earth, the kingdom was present, the control of God. That's the reason he healed, because he was in control. I will heal all of your diseases. That's the reason that when John the Baptist, well, we'll get there in a minute, or next week or sometime, but anyway, that's the idea when he told John, is going to tell John's messengers, that the two disciples that he sent, instead of saying, I am the one that you ought to be looking, you were right when you anticipated me coming in fulfillment of that, he just showed him kingdom, that is, rule or control things. Do you see how it all fits together? One of the joys that I'm having, in spite of parts falling off and aches and pains and all kinds of things, walking with a cane, all these kinds of good things, is I am beginning to perceive the world just automatically that way. And it is a joyous thing. I can see the actual events in terms of the control of God, even in my own life. I spend some time each day, a couple of times, in private association or openness or consciously in the presence of God. And he is answering that time by increasingly showing me what I've always known to be true, but could not see.
Here I am.
Yeah, I'm there. You know, I'll look in the new place, and guess what? He's there. He's always been there. I just didn't see him. So what I want you to get out of this is, if you don't immediately see him in aspects, just keep trying. It's like educating your eyes to see something. You will not see what you don't expect to see. I've learned that. And just relax and let God. See, that's the secret against anxiety.
I've seen that chicken.
Yeah. He's talking about a time that I got very embarrassed and actually paranoid about not being able to see a chicken. Once I had seen it, I could understand why my 18-month-old son could see it and I couldn't. I wasn't looking in the right way. Psychology calls it a gestalt. You've got to see it as a whole.
You see the pattern.
You've got to see the pattern, that's right. Okay, this is not rabbit chasing. This is exactly what Jesus is assuring this woman of. I am in control. I am the epitome of the rule and control of God. And so you can dry your tears. See, that's impossible to get in a translation.
Yeah.
You have to have that perception, that faith view, and you have to have it at a pretty internalized, deep level before you get all of that. And I know that as much as I see it now, I am not seeing, because the Apostle Paul rather late in his life said that eye has not seen nor ear heard what the glories of God are all about. Now I'm paraphrasing. He's actually talking about the wonders of the new heaven and the new earth, but of the new creation. But remember, we're already, in one sense, participating in that new creation. That's the reason that we can have joy here. It's, what is the old song? A foretaste of glory divine?
Oh, the foretaste of glory divine.
Yeah.
This to me is what will be so glorious in heaven. We'll be free to see and see more and see more.
As my friend Marshall Keeble used to say, we'll see as much as our spiritual buckets can hold. That's the reason there will be degrees of reward. Some of us actually are, I don't know whether it's inborn, educated, or what, but some of us are capable of seeing more than others. I remember the first time that I looked through a microscope at a stained slide of a 24-hour chick embryo. That I took a course in embryology, and we had to take our own eggs, incubate them, and then take them out. We had to take the embryo out, slice it, stain it, fix it, put it on the slide, and look at it. And the first time I looked at it, I didn't see anything except a jumble of colors and things that I didn't have a clue what they were. But as I educated my vision, I began to see. And after a while, I could tell you within a few minutes of what stage that embryo was, just because I had educated myself to see it. The lab assistant had educated me to see it.
I used to deal with this phenomenon all the time when I was selling audio equipment. People would either perceive better and better sound as they got better and better speakers, or they wouldn't. Some would spend hundreds of dollars on a speaker and could never tell the difference between that and $10 radio.
Okay.
But others would learn that. They would perceive it.
Well, that's like I told a fellow one time who looked at my sound system and said, "Oh, Charles, said, you can do much better than this." I said, "This one sounds better than I can hear. There's no use wasting the money. No use wasting money on it." See, that's the reason that we ought to exercise our perception. We ought to consciously look for God and His control. Maybe our buckets will get bigger. I can't promise that. I don't know. Okay, let's go on. That's enough for just two words. He then approached the open coffin and touched it. Now, open coffin is a literal translation. He probably wasn't in what we think of as a coffin. He was probably on what we would call a bier. That's what B-I-E-R, I think is the way you spell it. A rather firm pallet that would be carried on the shoulders of the young men of the village. And he would be there, and they would be carrying him to a place of burial. And touched it. There you could preach a whole series of sermons on the times that Jesus touched. I never will forget one of Max's most moving sermons was about the healing of a leper and how he emphasized the contrast between the villagers who fled away in horrible disgust at the approach of a leper, and Jesus walking up, and it says he touched him. Any of you ever hear any music from the 60s musical Jesus Christ Superstar? I never will forget a young girl alto at John Marshall High School, and we went as chaperones on a trip they took, and she sang, "He touched me." There wasn't a dry eye in the place. And because that's what it was all about, that Jesus touches us. One of the things that human beings need is to be touched in that way. People who have some kind of physical infirmity, some kind of maybe disgusting disease, or who feel that they are disgusting, there will nothing take the place of a human hug. And we can all do that. You can say, well, there's some people I couldn't touch. Yes, I can understand that. But you can always touch people intimately and lovingly that now you don't think you could. But you have to be sure you can, because there's nothing worse than to show body revulsion at the time you're supposed to be hugging. You may hug, but your body will react. And so that's the reason it has to be based on a genuine, deep faith in God. There are people I couldn't touch, even now. I have worked as a volunteer chaplain in the old Bear County Hospital, and I touched some people without any revulsion at all that I wouldn't have thought I could. But there were some that I couldn't, so I didn't try. I might hold their hand, I might come close, but I didn't fake it, because that's worse than nothing at all. So he touched the coffin. Actually,
Charles, I'm sorry. As a person that they perceived as a rabbi, wouldn't most Jews avoid touching the dead, because that was like that he was then unclean?
Thank you. I wouldn't have gone there, but that is exactly right. That was the reason that the priest and the Levite didn't touch the man who fell among robbers in the Good Samaritan.
Right, crossed over to the other side.
Yeah, it was not that they didn't want to help him. It was that they would become unclean
Right.
for their religious duties. And they and this is the message, by the way, that's going to be my next parable that I'm making a lesson for. That's the reason I should know this. And they, like the Jewish religious leaders, put their religious responsibilities above their human responsibilities. And Jesus never did that. He made his religious responsibilities and his human responsibilities identical. And that's that's the example that he,
at the well.
yeah, that's the thing about it.
Well, I love that picture, because the kingdom of God is not afraid of death. I mean, the kingdom of God just invades the grave.
Yes.
He reaches out and touches it.
And-
I can even go here.
See, Jesus, and this is another lesson that's there. He was so righteous, and I don't mean because he was God. He was so in relationship as a human being with his heavenly Father that instead of being polluted by the touch of death, he reversed death. What is it? He tasted of death for all men? That
Every funeral he attended.
yeah, yes. And he, by the way, he is still at the funeral of every believer. And he is standing by to touch them.
Sorry, we're discussing a little rabbit trail. Can you help us? They didn't embalm the body, right?
No,
And even now, Orthodox Jewish people, they don't embalm? Is that
No.
correct?
no, they don't embalm at all. That's the reason that when they had when they have emergencies in a big city like New York City, where for some reason they cannot bury people, they always make an exception. If they have to go out and blast frozen earth, or if the grave diggers are on strike, they will make an exception for Orthodox Jews and for Muslims. They have the same tradition. They have to be buried within 24 hours because they do not embalm, they do not do anything to the body except get it in the ground. So I want you to see the contrast there. The people, probably even the young men carrying the bier, would have drawn back. Jesus touched him. The pallbearer stopped, and I cannot be sure that they stopped means in startlement. It could just be out of respect for Jesus or something like that. Stopped, and he said, "Young man, get up." He said it in Aramaic, but you don't know any Aramaic, nor do I, so I put it in English. At the words, the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus returned him to his mother. Now, that little phrase that just seems so natural to us had great significance because Jesus literally returned him to his mother. She had lost him. We sometimes talk in terms of, I lost my son. I lost my husband. It doesn't mean they're misplaced. It means they're no longer available to us. And so Jesus, and I'm sure he did this with some degree of formality, because that's implied by the language. Mother, here is your son. But this is more than that, because he was her only support. We talked about that last week, you remember, that a widow had nobody to support them. I don't mean just financially, but emotionally and in any other way. Unless it's good, Jesse.
I've always had the idea here that when he put his hand on that bier, that at the same time they stopped and lowered it, and then that's when he said, "Get up," and
Jesse, that is a rational deduction that the language does not support at all. It probably went something like that, but
that's the way the words kind of float in my mind.
Yes, okay. That's okay for you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to teach that. Okay. they were all amazed and began to praise God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us." Now, do you notice the language? JT, what do you notice there? You were shaking your head.
Well, they're acknowledging the greatness of Jesus and what he was able to do.
Yeah. But why a prophet?
Oh, because of Elijah and
Exactly.
raising the,
Luke, like all New Testament writers, wants you to see the Old Testament background. The relationship between the Old Testament and the New is, I see it as much more intimate than we were ever taught when I was growing up and even when I was in graduate school. It is one of the major movements in New Testament studies today. By the way, N.T. Wright is leading that, and so is Copes. Did you say his name?
Capes.
Capes.
David Capes.
He is a professor of New Testament at the Houston Baptist Seminary. And I'm glad to see that a rather, what many people would think of as a minor seminary, has a scholar of his quality and level. It's a heartening thing to me to see how nearly all theological schools, now notice I say nearly all because a lot of them are not. I don't know how many, it's not my job to judge them. But how many, what would be called rather minor seminaries and Bible colleges are high, what a quality staff they have. Because that will lead us at every level. That's one of the reasons that I see a convergence of biblical theology throughout the evangelical world. We're way far from being the same, but there's increasing harmony. And we're going at Oak Hills, and I'm not chasing a rabbit, I did this on purpose to say this. When we do the I Believe series, one of the goals is to contribute to that convergence. There will be, I believe at last count, 1,900 churches all over the world, literally all over the world. You remember when Randy went to South Africa, last year sometime? And it seemed to me like it was kind of a mysterious thing. It wasn't. Nobody it was not a publicity trip or something. He went to check with churches in South Africa that are going to be teaching the series at the same time. There is a group of churches in San Antonio that will be teaching every Sunday the same elements. And then sometime in 2016, I think it's probably August, but I'm not sure, we've already reserved the Alamo Dome. And all the churches that have participated in this area, I don't know how many there are, will meet there for a joint Sunday morning worship service. I am thrilled to death to be part of that. For we're answering the prayer of Jesus in John 17, that they all may be one. That I translate, that they all may be in harmony with one another. It is not oneness in the sense of identity, not cookie cutter religion, but all singing a note that harmonizes with each other. I've used the example of
A chord rather
Yeah,
than a
yeah.
note.
using the example of sitting in when Douglas Fry, years ago, who was director of the ACU band, and he was practicing with the symphonic band, the one that played really high quality music. And they had a final chord that had 36 separate notes in it. There's not even any word to describe that chord. And it was a chord that you had to hit every instrument in that band in a harmonizing way, or it would be unbelievably dissonant. And they would come up to it, and my teeth would get on edge. And he would stop and say,
Junior high band concert.
"What?"
Like a junior high band concert
Yes.
in the first 2 months.
Yes, that's right. I remember my son playing trombone in the junior high. Anyway, and he would tell which instrument or which group of instruments were not right and what the note they ought to play, and they would try again. And after about 10 or 12 attempts, they hit it. And that's what heaven is going to sound like. That's what it's all about. Harmony. And we can contribute to harmony. But we must not insist that everybody play the same note. That would be horrible, monotonous. Now, once in a while, it's okay to play the same note, but you wouldn't want it for a whole piece of music. And that is God's vision of what He wants from His church, is harmony. A great prophet has risen up. As I said, this is a definite referral to Elijah and the widow's son. And God has visited His people. Now, this is another way in which the Old and the New Testament are intertwined. What does it mean for God to visit somebody? You two stay quiet. Anybody? Come on. You can't be anything other than somewhat right. Well, it's presence, but it's far more than that. Why does God visit people? Why did Michael visit Mary?
A specific message for that individual?
More than that.
Good news.
What?
Good news.
Yes.
You talking about Gabriel?
Gabriel, I tell you what.
I was sensitive because my name was being.
Okay. Yes, Gabriel. God visits to give a blessing. Blessed art thou among women. I'm quoting the Vulgate there, the translation of the Vulgate. That is, we always think about the responsibility and the possible shame. That's not what Luke quotes in context. It is, He came to bless her. You are going to become the vessel through whom God sends His Son into the world. That's a blessing. Now, she was willing to suffer the possible humiliation because it was a blessing. And that's what it's all about for us, folks. God blesses us. If that includes humiliation, that's really irrelevant. It's not what it's all about. So when it says God visits a person or his people, he comes to confer a blessing.
In my New American Standard, it has a little side note that word, whatever it is, has visited, could be translated as has cared for his people.
Yes. That's the reason I translated it visit. Because it just means has come. Usually it means just presence. I mean, that's the way it's translated someway. But it does mean he has come to care for. Thank you. If I'd have known that, I probably would have translated it that way.
NIV put help.
Yes.
Help?
Help. That is the back that I wanted to get from visit. I decided to use visit and consistently because it is a personal thing. See, if somebody visits you, they're there, available to you. Now, we humans can visit for good purposes or bad, but God cannot, and God will not. He comes to help.
And didn't the Jewish people feel like God hadn't visited them for how many hundreds of years since the last prophet?
400.
They were just like kind of being left alone there.
Okay, we Goys and New Testament people probably misunderstand at least the essence of what they were thinking. Let me tell you, I'm just quickly, this is not chasing a rabbit exactly, but it's close to it. They realized that the promise of God to return his people had not been fulfilled.
I guess you're talking also about redemption, right?
Well, it's more than that. It is the promise that I will bring my people back from captivity. And they realized that promise was at best only half fulfilled, and at worst not fulfilled at all, because there were more Jews living among the Gentiles than there were all the Jews together in Palestine.
There seemed to be also an indication that at the time of the building of Solomon's temple, all the dedication ceremony and everything was repeated at the second temple, but there's one absence, and that is God answered the sacrifices by fire in the case of Solomon, and he didn't in the case of the second temple.
Yes, and that is, I'm sure, from some of the intertestamental Jewish literature, that is mentioned. I know that that's true. And so that they were expecting God to visit them as he did when that first temple was, In other words, the sacrifice would be demonstrated to be acceptable to God, and that was lacking. Probably by this time the tablets of stone were no longer in there. Probably in the Ark of the Covenant, the box of the agreement, to get it in literal language, there was nothing, and that meant that God was not, that God's full presence was not there. And that's what they expected. So, God has visited us is a weighty theological statement. What this is a recognition by these people that Jesus was who he claimed to be. God was present there.
He was visiting.
Now, but where was this?
The town of Nain.
What?
The town of Nain?
And where was Nain? In Galilee of the Gentiles. Every recognition of the Messiahship of Jesus came from Gentile sources, including a certain Samaritan woman at the well. Everyone.
I just had a thought.
Okay.
The comment that Jesus made about the sign of Jonah, that was where the Gentiles responded, but Jonah the prophet did not respond.
Exactly. And that's not accidental. The book of Jonah is there as a prophetic book. I don't think Jonah wrote it.
Right. Yeah, me neither. because
It's all in the third person. That's not absolutely sure that he didn't, but I don't think he did. And it was written to the Jews to say, get with it, folks. God is going to select the Gentiles ahead of you if you don't start doing what the covenant requires of you, and that's to get God's name blessed among the Gentiles. Do you see how all of this fits together?
Got a question. You say this funeral was happening in Gentile Galilee.
Uh-huh.
And when he raised the child, I would assume that's a Gentile, and I would assume the pallbearers are Gentile.
No,
And when they're recognizing what Jesus has done, they say God has visited his people.
Okay.
His people.
Okay, you're right, but you're making an assumption. The people who were most intimately involved were Jews, but the bystanders didn't have to be. See, Luke makes it very clear. They were all amazed, and that may have included Jews. Some Jews would recognize. See, you remember going back to the old man, in the temple? Now let your servant, because he and Anna were anticipating the arrival of the Messiah. So what I was, and I see I left the wrong idea, and it's my responsibility. And that is, Galilee of the Gentiles doesn't mean that everybody there was a Gentile. It means that a lot of them were, and that the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, therefore, just wrote Galilee off. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? That is the attitude of the religious leaders in Jerusalem. And so here, that's where people at the periphery, not where the leaders were, but where there was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles, they recognized, because they did not have their hearts seared and their eyes blinded by their religious prejudices, they saw that God had visited his people.
At the trial of Jesus, the ladies said something about Peter being from Galilee.
Oh, yeah.
And so the disciples themselves were from Galilee, most of them. So, and Jesus was from Nazareth, which is in Galilee.
And now, the next sentence is that's Luke puts it there to nail down this point. This report about him spread throughout Judea and the nearby areas. That is, the fact that he had been hailed as the presence of God. Now, notice that it still was not the full recognition, but this report, I was tempted to put rumor there, but that's that would have been too racy, so I didn't. But the idea is, this was spread by word of mouth, and this accounts for the triumphal entry. See, we see all of these things, and they're so familiar to us that we have ceased to see the contrast and the nuances. That's the reason I go so slowly in teaching. I want to recapture for you the things that the people who read this and experienced it would have gotten automatically. And that's the reason that I use all kinds of illustrations and imaginative reconstructions, and I can tell from your expression when I'm successful or even somewhat successful. I see your face light up and you say, oh, you know.
They didn't have radio and television?
They didn't even have PowerPoint. Okay, that's the thing that I want to get. This report about him spread throughout Judea and nearby areas. This is one of the characteristics of Luke's literary style. He will throw in these generalizing statements at the end of the majority of the pericopes and scenes that he touched. He wants you to realize that this is a representative scene. It is unique. It historically happened and all that, but it is a symbol of other things going on, and it has to do with the impact of Jesus, his teaching, and his actions. And as I said, this accounts for the joyous, triumphal entry. But it was not the whole story, because less than a week later, some of the same group were saying, crucify him. Okay. John's disciples told him about all these happenings. Now notice the link between the last sentence and the beginning of this pericope. Pericope being the little units in which the gospel, the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are written. John's disciples told him about all these happenings, and he selected two of them and sent them to the Lord to ask him. Now, John, where was John? In prison. I don't think that John had the same faith that Paul had in prison that Max was preaching about this morning. And he began, and here is the thing, it is because, not because John lacked faith, but that his faith was based on a false premise. He had the premise of the Jews that the Messiah would be a freedom fighter. Now, I chose that word to get away from this glib statement, you know, the Jews wanted an earthly kingdom, and we know better than that. We look for a spiritual kingdom. That is so wrong in so many ways that it's false. We look for an earthly kingdom, but not this earth. A new heaven and a new earth. So, see, you have to get down to the details before you have a right to sit in judgment, and then if you won't sit in judgment because you won't need to. That's what John wants us to see. John is very concerned. What he expected to happen is not happening. And so he sends. He said, "Are you the coming one?" I put this in capitals because this is a title. It's a messianic title. It's not just the one who is to come, like it's usually translated. That's an accurate translation, but it doesn't convey the nuance to us that it would to them. They would immediately recognize that as a messianic title. And so what he's saying is, are you the Messiah, or are you like me, merely a forerunner, a prophet? It's not the denial of his power or anything. It is, am I mistaken in identifying you as the Messiah? And makes a little difference. Many people just fault John, oh, he's losing his faith. No, he was concerned. He wanted to honor Jesus, but he wanted to know, should he expect somebody else?
We also know now through the Qumran community scrolls that were discovered, the fact that in some communities they expected multiple messiahs or multiple persons, and so that might be a
Yes,
play here.
there is probably, now I want to hedge this about with some, there is probably a connection between John and the Qumran community, that he represents more that kind of Jewish thinking. Now, I don't mean he was a member of it, but that he represents that kind. He was ascetic, and they were ascetic. He stayed in the wilderness. That means they divorced themselves from the religious leaders in Jerusalem. John divorced himself from the religion, and he had this idea that there's possibly multiple manifestations of the Messiah. They originally decided that there were two, and that's probably where they came down finally, but don't know for sure. And the reason was they saw in Isaiah that there was a theme of the triumphal Messiah and the theme of the suffering Messiah. And they could not get their heads around that could possibly be the same person. And it's difficult if you start with Isaiah and come forward. You start with the resurrection and go backward, it's easy, because the suffering is on the cross and the triumph is in the resurrection. See? But nobody had ever been raised from the dead. And it's still the central miracle of all time. God becoming flesh, suffering in every way we human beings suffer, and then triumphing over death. And so you see, that's the context of John's question. Are you really the Messiah? Or should we expect as the Qumran groups expected, a suffering Messiah and a triumphal Messiah. Jesse, I want to go this way.
Okay.
Okay. Should we anticipate the coming of someone else? When the men reached him, they said, "Are you the coming one, or should we anticipate the coming of someone else?" Now, this is in the Greek a direct quotation. In other words, John commissioned them, and Luke put that in what's called indirect discourse. That is, not direct quotation. And then when they got to Jesus, they carried out, and Luke wants you to know that, they carried out the literal commission. They said, "Are you the coming one, or should we anticipate the coming of someone else?"